Hey there, and welcome back to Bedtime Survivalist, where every night we crawl into a different corner of history and ask the same quiet question. How did they make it through? Tonight, we are burrowing into one of the coldest, hardest, and strangely most tender stories in all of medieval life. How ordinary peasants, with no chimneys, no glass windows, and absolutely no central heating, survived winter nights so bitter that the wind itself seemed to have opinions about your survival. Before we sink into the straw, a warm thank you to everyone who has been requesting this one in the comments. Your suggestions are the reason this channel keeps growing, and I read every single one, usually far too late at night with a cup of tea going cold on the desk beside me, which feels weirdly appropriate for tonight's topic. If you enjoy these slow wanders through history, a like and a subscribe helps more sleepy wanderers find their way here, though only if you actually feel like it. No pressure whatsoever. We are also on Spotify now, so if you would rather just listen with your eyes closed, that link is waiting patiently in the description. And if you want more than one episode a night, channel membership gives you access to hours of ad-free video to drift off to whenever the world gets too loud and you need somewhere quiet to land. Now, pull your blanket up around your shoulders, maybe double it if you have one to spare, because irony demands it. Dim the lights, switch on a fan if you have one, just for that low, steady hum. The kind of sound that makes a room feel smaller and safer at the same time. Let your shoulders drop from your ears and let us begin. Have you ever really thought about what winter used to mean before a wall switch could summon warmth out of thin air? Could you have slept soundly, knowing the fire had to last until dawn on nothing but a shovel of ash and a prayer? Would you have found comfort in the breathing of a cow 3 feet from your head? Or would the smell and the shuffling have kept you wide awake? Could you have shared one bed with your parents, your siblings, maybe your grandmother, and found it a mercy rather than a hardship? And could you have fallen asleep not to silence, but to the creak of timber, the hiss of wind through a gap in the thatch, and the low, patient sound of a whole household breathing together in the dark? Well, get comfortable, because tonight you're going to find out. You have just woken up, or rather, you're about to fall asleep, somewhere in Northern Europe, sometime in the 13 or 1400s, in a small house built of mud and timber, standing in a village buried past its windowsills in snow. There is no thermostat here. There is no second blanket in a closet down the hall. There is only what your hands built, what your neighbours share, and what your own body can offer the people sleeping beside you. This is the story of how that was enough. Most nights, anyway. Picture the village as the light finally gives up for the day. It is the deep middle of winter, and the sun set hours ago in the way it does at this latitude in this season, sliding sideways below the horizon almost as an afterthought, as if it too would rather be somewhere warmer. Smoke rises from a scatter of low roofs, thin grey threads climbing straight up in the still air, before the wind catches them and drags them sideways over the snow. There is no glow of streetlight, no distant hum of anything electrical, nothing but the soft orange flicker escaping through cracks in shuttered windows here and there, like the village itself is a row of sleepy, half-closed eyes. One by one, those slivers of light are narrowing. Shutters are being pulled to. Doors are being barred against a cold that does not knock. It simply waits outside for any opening you are foolish enough to leave it. This is not a world with central heating tucked into the walls, or insulation rolled out beneath the floorboards, or a boiler humming quietly in some unseen room. This is a world where warmth had to be built, tended, and above all, shared, every single night, by hand, by breath, and by body. And that is really the heart of everything we're about to walk through together. Not clever machines, not miracle inventions, but people leaning on each other, quite literally, to survive a season that could kill the careless in a single unlucky night. Warmth in this world was never really a thing. It was an activity, something you did together, or you did not do at all. Let your mind settle into that village for a moment before we step inside any particular door. Understand first what you are looking at, because it will tell you almost everything about how the night ahead is going to unfold. These are not grand stone halls with roaring hearths in every room. Most of what you're looking at, dotted across the snow in loose clusters along a single frozen lane, are small, low, one-room cottages, home to families who own perhaps a few animals, a little land, and not very much else besides the clothes on their backs and the roof over their heads. And even that roof, we should say gently, was often barely holding on by the third month of winter. It had been patched, rethatched, and prayed over more times than anyone in the household could count. This was not deprivation in the dramatic sense we sometimes imagine when we picture the medieval poor. It was simply ordinary life, repeated in 10,000 villages for hundreds of years by people who did not know any other way of living and who, by and large, found ways to endure it that were resourceful, communal, and honestly rather moving once you look closely enough. There is a stillness to a snow-covered village at night that modern ears are almost unfamiliar with. No engines, no electrical hum, just wind, the occasional low complaint of a beast shifting its weight in a stall, the creak of a timber frame settling under the cold, and somewhere, faintly, the soft crunch of someone's boots on frozen ground as they hurry the last stretch of the walk home before the light is entirely gone. Sound carries strangely in that kind of cold. A dog barking 2 farms over might sound as though it is standing beside you, and underneath it all, if you stood quietly enough in the lane, you might hear the low murmur of dozens of households doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same hour. Banking their fires, gathering their children, bringing the animals in close, getting ready, in the most literal sense, to keep each other alive until morning. Because that, more than anything else, is the thesis of tonight's whole story. Medieval peasants did not survive freezing winters through some forgotten technology we have since lost. And they did not survive through sheer stoic toughness alone, though there was plenty of that too. They survived through closeness, physical, deliberate, unavoidable closeness between people and animals, between a family and the small, stubborn fire at the center of their home. Heat, in a world without furnaces, is not something you generate from nothing. It is something you conserve, and the best way anyone had found to conserve it was to gather every living, breathing, heat-producing thing you owned into one small space and let biology do quietly what no machine yet could. So, before we step through any one particular door tonight, hold that thought gently in your mind. Everything else we are about to explore, the walls, the fire, the animals, the bed itself, is really just a variation on this one theme. Warmth was communal. Warmth was earned. And warmth, more often than not, smelled faintly of livestock and wood smoke and was survived one careful, unglamorous night at a time. Let us step inside then and see exactly what kind of house was standing between a family and a winter that did not care whether they lived or died. Picture the cottage as you approach it through the snow, low and dark against the white ground, its roof sloping down almost to head height at the eaves, as though it is hunching its shoulders against the cold the same way you are. This is, in most cases, a single room, one space serving as kitchen, bedroom, workshop, and occasionally stable, all folded into whatever square footage the family could manage to build and maintain. There is no upstairs to retreat to when things get crowded, no separate chamber for privacy, no door to shut between one part of life and another. Everything that matters happens here, within these four walls, under this one roof, around this one fire. The walls themselves are built from a technique called wattle and daub, and it is worth understanding exactly what that means because it explains so much about how these homes actually behaved in winter. Builders wove a lattice of thin branches and sticks, the wattle, between the upright timber posts of the house frame, creating something like a woven basket standing on its end. Over that lattice they packed daub, a thick, sticky mixture of mud, straw, sometimes dung, and whatever else was on hand, to bind it all together. Left to dry and harden, this became the wall itself, dense enough to block the wind, thick enough to hold a surprising amount of warmth once the fire had been going a while, though nowhere near as efficient as modern insulation. It was, in its own rough and homemade way, a genuinely clever solution to a genuinely difficult problem, built from nothing more than what the land immediately around the house could provide. Above the walls sat a roof of thatch, tightly bundled straw or reed, layered again and again, until it shed rain and, crucially, for tonight's story, trapped a surprising amount of heat beneath it. Thatch is a remarkably good insulator when properly maintained, and a well-thatched roof could make the difference between a home that merely survived winter and one that genuinely retained warmth night after night. The trouble, of course, was maintenance. A roof battered by wind, snow, and the occasional over-enthusiastic winter storm needed constant attention, and a family that fell behind on repairs might find themselves lying awake, counting new gaps in the ceiling by the pale light of the last embers, feeling every degree of heat slip out through the very roof meant to keep it in. Beneath your feet, more often than not, was simply the earth itself, packed hard by years of footsteps, sometimes strewn with straw or rushes to soften it underfoot and add one more thin layer between the sleeping family and the frozen ground below. There was no wood flooring to speak of in most peasant homes, certainly nothing raised above the cold earth on joists the way we might imagine today. You lived, quite literally, on the ground, and the ground, in the depths of winter, was not a warm place to be. This is one of the small, unglamorous details that mattered enormously at the time and is easy for us to overlook now. Every layer of straw between a family and the frozen dirt beneath them was doing real, meaningful work, holding back a cold that would otherwise creep upward through bare feet and blankets alike. And then there is the matter of the smoke, because here is where the medieval one-room cottage becomes something genuinely strange to a modern mind. Most peasant homes had no chimney at all. The fire burned in the centre of the room or against one wall, and the smoke it produced simply rose and searched for its own way out, drifting up toward the roof, curling along the underside of the thatch and eventually finding an exit through a hole left deliberately in the roof, or through gaps around the eaves, or sometimes simply through the thatch itself. This sounds to us like an obvious design flaw. Surely a household breathing wood smoke every single night would have found some better solution. But the truth is more complicated and rather more sensible once you think it through. A chimney, for all its benefits, is also a very efficient way of pulling warm air straight out of a house and up into the sky. Every peasant family understood this instinctively, even if none of them could have explained it in terms of thermodynamics. Keep the smoke inside a little longer, let it linger under the roof before it finally escapes, and you keep the heat inside a little longer too. The smoke was, in a very real sense, the price paid for warmth. Eyes stung, clothes carried the scent of wood smoke for days, but the alternative, a clean, smoke-free room that bled its warmth straight out through a chimney flue, was a trade nobody particularly wanted to make. Windows, where they existed at all, were small, few, and almost never glazed with anything resembling glass, which remained a luxury far out of reach for ordinary peasant households. Instead, openings were covered with wooden shutters, sometimes lined with cloth soaked in oil to let in a little diffuse light, while still holding back the worst of the wind. On the coldest nights, those shutters stayed firmly closed from the moment the light began to fade until well after the sun returned the next morning, sealing the family inside a room lit only by the fire, dim, warm-toned, and close in every sense of the word. There was no glancing out at the snow falling under a street lamp. There was only the sound of the wind outside and the low light inside, and the walls holding the two apart, standing inside a home like this on a night deep in January. You would notice how small the space actually felt once you accounted for everyone and everything that needed to fit inside it. A family. Their few animals if the season demanded it, whatever tools and stores they could not risk leaving outside, all pressed together beneath one low thatched roof, all breathing the same smoky air, all depending on the same small fire. It would have felt crowded by our standards, certainly, but it would also have felt, in its own particular way, safe. Every wall was doing a job. Every low ceiling was trapping heat that would otherwise rise and vanish. Every choice in the construction of that home, whether the builders thought of it this way or not, was ultimately a choice made in service of one single goal, getting a family through to spring. And at the very heart of that goal, quite literally at the centre of the room in most cases, sat the one thing every single person in that house was quietly, constantly aware of throughout the long winter night: the fire. Let us turn to it now, because if the walls and the roof were the skeleton of survival, the hearth was its beating, flickering heart. In a home with no chimney and no easy way to add fuel through the night, without risking everyone's safety, the fire had to be managed with real skill, real care, and a set of customs so widespread across medieval Europe that they eventually found their way into law. As dusk settled fully into night, the household would gather close around whatever fire remained, watching the flames shrink from something bright and generous into something smaller, quieter, and more careful. This was not a moment of disappointment. It was the plan working exactly as intended. Burning wood all night at full strength was neither practical nor safe. Fuel was precious and had to be gathered, chopped, and dried across the warmer months in quantities that had to last an entire winter, which meant no household could afford to burn through it carelessly. And a fire left blazing unattended through the night in a home built largely of timber and thatch with everyone asleep on the floor around it was a genuine and terrifying danger. Fires that got away from their hearths could take an entire home, and sometimes an entire row of homes, in the time it took a family to wake and realize what was happening. So instead, as the evening wore on, someone in the household, often the person most practiced at the task, would begin the nightly ritual of banking the fire. Rather than letting it burn down and die out completely, they would carefully rake the glowing embers into a compact pile and then cover that pile with a layer of ash, sometimes with a specially shaped clay or metal cover designed for exactly this purpose. The ash acted as insulation, slowing the rate at which the embers burned and starved themselves of air, allowing a small, smouldering core of heat to survive quietly through the long hours of darkness, without consuming much fuel at all and without any open flame that might catch and spread. There is a wonderful piece of language hiding inside this small nightly ritual, one that has survived far longer than the practice itself. The custom of covering the fire each evening became so widespread and in many places so strictly enforced by local authorities concerned about the very real danger of house fires spreading through tightly packed villages that it acquired its own name in Old French, couvre-feu, literally cover fire. Over the centuries and after crossing into English, that phrase softened and shifted in meaning until it became the word we still use today, curfew, though it has long since lost its connection to fireplaces and taken on an entirely different sense of nightly restriction. But its origins sit right here, in this quiet, careful moment repeated in cottage after cottage across the medieval world, as families tucked their fires in for the night, the same way they tucked in their children. There is something genuinely tender about this small daily act, if you sit with it for a moment. The last thing a family did before settling in to sleep was not simply extinguishing their fire and leaving themselves in total darkness and cold. It was protecting it, preserving a small ember of warmth and light through the hardest, coldest hours of the night, so that come morning, that same fire could be coaxed back to life with a little fresh fuel and some careful breath, rather than having to be built entirely from scratch in the freezing dark. In a world without matches, without any quick and easy way to summon flame from nothing, an ember that survived the night was worth more than almost anything else the household owned. Fire, once lost completely, had to be either painstakingly struck anew using flint and steel, a slow and finicky process, or borrowed, quite literally, from a neighbour's hearth, carried carefully through the freezing dark in some kind of covered vessel. Losing your fire entirely on a winter night was not a small inconvenience. It could be, in the truest sense, a matter of survival, which is precisely why the ritual of banking the embers was treated with the seriousness it deserved. Picture then the last moments before full darkness settles over the cottage. The family gathers close, perhaps sharing a final quiet exchange of the day, watching as the flames are allowed to shrink and settle. There is a particular kind of stillness in watching a fire go from something bright and active to something small, orange and steady. A transition every person in that room would have witnessed thousands of times across their lives, and yet one that likely never entirely lost its quiet, hypnotic pull. The light dims, shadows lengthen and merge into the corners of the room. Faces that were sharply lit a few minutes earlier soften into silhouette. And then, carefully, the ash is drawn over the embers, the room grows darker still, and the household turns, as one, toward the bed. It is worth remembering, too, that this fire was never purely functional. It was the emotional center of the household as much as the physical one. Whatever conversation, whatever storytelling, whatever quiet moment of rest the family found in the depths of a long winter day, it very likely happened here, gathered close around this same small fire, faces lit gold against the deepening dark outside the shutters. In a home with no other source of light, once the sun went down, the fire was where the evening's life concentrated itself, where a mother might mend clothing by its glow, where children might be told the same stories their parents had been told as children themselves, huddled in exactly this spot decades before, where the entire rhythm of a winter's evening slowed, narrowed, and drew inward toward this one warm point of light in an otherwise cold and darkening world. And once that fire had been banked, once the embers had been tucked beneath their blanket of ash and the room had settled into its dim, glowing near darkness, there was one more source of warmth the family could turn to before finally lying down to sleep. One that did not require any fuel at all, that asked for nothing but a little space and a little tolerance, and that many households, especially the poorest, relied upon just as heavily as the fire itself. It was time to bring the animals in close. For a great many peasant families across medieval Europe, the line between the human living space and the animal living space was not nearly as firm as we might assume today. In what historians often call a longhouse or byre house, a single structure was divided, sometimes only informally, between one end where the family lived, cooked, and slept, and the other end where the household's animals, cattle most commonly, though sometimes pigs, goats, or sheep, depending on what the family kept, spent their nights as well. There was often no solid wall between the two sections, simply a low partition, a change in floor level, or, in the humblest homes, no division at all beyond an unspoken understanding of which corner belonged to whom. To modern sensibilities, the idea of sleeping within a few feet of livestock, separated by nothing more than open air and perhaps a low wooden rail, can sound uncomfortable at best. But to the families who lived this way, it was neither strange nor unpleasant. It was simply practical, and in the depths of winter, it was genuinely, measurably useful. A full-grown cow generates a remarkable amount of body heat simply by existing, by breathing, by digesting the hay and fodder that made up its winter diet. Multiply that by 2 or 3 animals kept in one end of a small enclosed space, and you have, in effect, a living, breathing furnace, requiring no fuel of your own gathering, no tending through the night, and no risk of sparking a fire that could take the whole roof with it. The animals themselves became a source of warmth every bit as real, in their own quiet way, as the banked embers on the hearth. There would have been sounds, of course, that a modern sleeper might find distracting. The shift and shuffle of hooves on packed earth, the low, occasional sound of an animal settling itself more comfortably, or lifting its head at some small noise in the dark, the steady rhythm of breathing, deeper and slower than any human breath, coming from the far end of the room. And there would have been smells too, undeniably, the warm, faintly sweet, faintly sharp scent of livestock mingling with wood smoke, and the particular smell of a home lived in through a long winter without much opportunity for airing out. But for those who grew up with it, this was not an unpleasant intrusion into their rest. It was, if anything, oddly comforting, a reminder, even in the depths of the darkest, coldest hours, that you were not alone in that room, that other warm, living creatures were close by, breathing steadily through the same long night, part of the same small, shared effort to simply make it to morning. There is something worth pausing on here in how naturally this arrangement folded warmth, safety, and practicality into a single, simple decision. The animals needed shelter from the winter just as much as the family did, and housing them separately in some outbuilding of their own would have meant either leaving them exposed to a cold that could genuinely kill livestock, or building and heating an entirely separate structure that most peasant families simply could not afford, in materials or in fuel. Bringing them inside solved both problems in one stroke. The animals were protected. The family gained an unpaid, unfussy source of nightly warmth, and the whole household, human and animal alike, weathered the worst of the season together, under one roof, breathing one shared, smoky, faintly barnyard-scented air. It is easy, from the comfort of a modern bedroom, to imagine this arrangement as a hardship, a grim necessity endured rather than embraced. But the historical picture that survives suggests something gentler than that. This was simply how life worked, generation after generation, in village after village. Children grew up with the low sound of livestock as an ordinary part of night-time, the same way we might grow up with the hum of a refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic. It became part of the texture of rest itself, one more thread woven into the particular, hard-won comfort of a medieval winter night. And as the family finally turned from the fire and from the low sounds coming from the far end of the room toward their own bed for the night, they were about to rely on one final, crucial layer of warmth, built not from timber or embers or livestock, but from straw, wool, and each other. Let us turn, then, to the bed itself, because this is where every thread of tonight's story finally comes together in one place. After the walls had done their work holding back the wind, after the fire had been carefully banked to smoulder quietly through the dark hours, after the animals had settled into their own corner of the shared room, there remained one last and perhaps most important source of warmth available to a medieval peasant family, and that was each other. The bed, in a typical peasant household, bore very little resemblance to what we picture today. In the poorest homes, it might be nothing more than a pallet laid directly on the earthen floor, close to the fire for whatever residual warmth still lingered in the room. In slightly more comfortable households, a simple wooden frame might raise the sleeping area a little off the ground, keeping the worst of the floor's cold at bay. Either way, the mattress itself, if we can even call it that, was typically a large cloth sack stuffed with straw, sometimes layered with dried grass, bracken, or whatever soft, insulating material the family had managed to gather and dry over the previous months. It was not soft in the way we think of softness now. It rustled with every movement, flattened unevenly over time, and needed regular refilling as the straw compacted and lost its loft. But it did its job. It lifted the sleeper away from the coldest layer of air, the layer that hovers stubbornly just above bare ground, and it added one more barrier of trapped, insulating air between a tired body and a freezing world. Over the top of this straw mattress came the blankets, and here, more than almost anywhere else in the medieval home, wool proved itself as one of the great quiet technologies of the age. Wool holds warmth remarkably well, even when damp, traps air within its fibres in a way that creates natural insulation, and was, crucially, something ordinary households could produce and process themselves from their own sheep, if they kept any, or acquire through trade with neighbours who did. Heavy wool blankets, sometimes multiple layers of them stacked one atop another as the winter deepened, formed the primary defence against the cold once the family had settled down for the night. For those with slightly greater means, furs might supplement the wool, offering an extra layer of warmth for the household's most vulnerable members, the very young, the very old, anyone recovering from illness. For the poorest families, blankets might be supplemented with whatever cloth could be spared, old clothing, worn fabric, anything with enough substance to hold in a little more warmth. And then, most crucially of all, there was the simple, unavoidable fact that in the vast majority of peasant households the entire family slept together, in one bed, under one collection of blankets, sharing warmth in the most direct and literal way imaginable. Parents and children, sometimes grandparents too if they lived under the same roof, would arrange themselves close together beneath the layered wool, not out of any particular sentimentality, though surely some warmth of that kind existed too, but out of plain physical necessity. Body heat, shared between several people pressed close together beneath a mound of insulating wool, created a microclimate of real, measurable warmth that no single sleeper could ever generate alone. The very youngest children were often tucked into the centre of this arrangement, protected on every side by the bodies of parents and older siblings in the warmest possible position the family bed could offer. This was, in the truest sense, thermodynamics practiced by instinct rather than science, a solution arrived at not through any formal understanding of heat transfer, but through generations of simply noticing what worked and what did not, and passing that quiet wisdom down through the practice of ordinary family life. There is a word sometimes used for this instinct, to burrow close together beneath layers of warmth, and though it comes from a much later century, nesting captures the feeling rather well. Beneath the heavy wool in the deepening cold of a winter night, a family did not so much lie down to sleep as construct. Together, a small warm world of their own making, sealed off as best they could manage from the freezing air pressing in against the shuttered windows and the thatched roof above. Many peasants, particularly in the coldest months, did not fully undress before sleeping the way we might imagine, but rather kept on simple shifts or additional layers of clothing, adding yet another modest barrier between skin and cold air. Undressing fully in a room with no reliable warmth once the fire had been banked was, quite reasonably, not a risk most families were eager to take. Lying there in the near total dark of a room lit only by the faintest orange glow escaping the edges of the banked fire, surrounded by the warmth of parents, siblings, perhaps a grandparent's steady breathing close by, and beyond the low partition, the shifting, breathing presence of the household's animals, a medieval peasant drifted towards sleep inside a small, carefully constructed pocket of survivable warmth, built from nothing more than mud walls, banked embers, shared straw, layered wool, and the simple, ancient comfort of not being alone in the cold. It was not luxurious. It was not, by our standards, particularly comfortable. But it worked, night after night, winter after winter, for centuries, sustaining families through a season that could have killed them many times over, through nothing more sophisticated than closeness, patience, and the quiet, practiced wisdom of knowing exactly how to keep a small fire, a small room, and a small family warm enough to see the dawn. Sleep did not always arrive smoothly, even once a household had settled beneath its layers of wool pressed close together in the dark. The medieval winter night rarely stayed the same from 1 hour to the next, and it rarely stayed silent. Wind found every gap that mud and timber had failed to seal completely, pressing against the shutters with a low, insistent moan that rose and fell like something almost alive. Timber frames, contracting in the cold, creaked and settled in ways that could sound in a dark room almost like footsteps, before the mind caught up and recognized it as nothing more than wood behaving the way wood behaves in freezing temperatures. Outside, snow settled with its own peculiar hush, a sound less like sound and more like the absence of it, deepening the silence that blanketed the whole village until morning. There is a particular quality to stillness in a snowbound medieval village that is genuinely difficult to recreate in the modern world. In a village with no engines, no electricity, and only a scattering of banked fires glowing behind shuttered windows, silence was the dominant fact of the night, broken only by wind, by the occasional shift of an animal in its stall, by the settling of snow on the thatch above, and by the steady breathing of the people sharing your bed. Sound that did occur carried unusually far and unusually clear. A dog barking at the far edge of the village might sound as though it stood just beyond your own door. Light, too, behaved differently than we are used to. There was no artificial glow leaking in from outside, no street lamp casting shapes across a ceiling. Once the shutters were closed and the fire banked to its faint orange smoulder, the room existed in something close to true darkness, broken only by the dimmest suggestion of embers glowing beneath their layer of ash, and, on clear nights, by whatever faint moonlight managed to slip through the narrow cracks around the shutters. A darkness this complete asks something different of the body than the soft, technology-diluted dark most of us know today. It asks you to listen more carefully, to feel rather than see the shape of the room around you. Within that deep, wind-pressed, snow-hushed darkness, there is genuine historical evidence suggesting that medieval sleep itself did not always resemble our own modern, single, unbroken stretch of 8 hours. Historians studying pre-industrial Europe have found reasonably widespread references, scattered across letters, court records, and literature, to a pattern often described as segmented sleep, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep. Rather than lying down once and rising once, many households across this period appear to have slept in 2 distinct phases, with a waking period of an hour or so settled quietly in between. This first sleep might begin not long after the fire was banked, carrying the household through the first several hours of full darkness, before a natural waking occurred somewhere in the deep middle of the night, an interval that was not treated as insomnia, but simply as an ordinary, expected part of how the night unfolded. During this quiet waking interval, households do not appear to have fully roused themselves the way we might if startled awake today. Instead, this middle stretch of wakefulness seems to have been used gently, suited to the deep dark and the deep cold. Some accounts suggest it was a time for quiet prayer, occurring as it did in the hushed, private hours when the mind, freshly rested from the first sleep, was calm rather than groggy. Others suggest it was simply a time for low, murmured talk between family members, the kind of unhurried exchange that daytime labour rarely allowed room for. It may have been a moment to glance toward the fire, confirming the banked embers still held, before settling back down. Small children might have been nursed or soothed. An older member of the household might have used the interval to finish some small task daylight had left undone. It is worth being careful here in the same spirit of honest curiosity this whole story deserves. The evidence for segmented sleep is genuinely documented across this broad period, but it should be understood as a recorded cultural pattern rather than a fixed rule every medieval person followed every single night without exception. Sleep, then as now, likely varied by household, by season, by sheer exhaustion. A family worn down from a hard day's labour with little to do once darkness fell may well have simply slept through in one long stretch some nights and drifted into the documented two-phase pattern on others. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that this rhythm was familiar enough, common enough, to leave its trace across historical records, suggesting it was, for a great many people across a great many centuries, simply one ordinary shape a long winter night could take. There is something quietly beautiful in imagining that middle waking hour gently rather than clinically. A whole household waking not out of alarm but out of habit, into the deepest, darkest part of the night, and finding in that waking not fear, but a kind of soft, private calm. No obligations pressing in yet, just the low glow of embers somewhere nearby, the sound of breathing settling back into rhythm around you. Perhaps a murmured word exchanged before sleep gently reclaimed the room and carried everyone toward the second phase of rest. Even within this rhythm, and beneath every layer of wool and straw and shared warmth we have already explored, the cold of a medieval winter night was rarely entirely defeated. It was managed, held at bay, kept survivable, but very seldom eliminated outright, which is why families reached for whatever small additional comforts they could manage on the coldest nights of the year. One of the gentlest of these involved nothing more complicated than a stone or sometimes a brick, warmed carefully by the hearth before bedtime. As the fire was tended through the evening, before the final banking of the embers, a stone might be placed close to the flames, allowed to slowly absorb and hold heat the way stone does so well, retaining warmth long after being pulled away from direct flame. Once sufficiently warmed, it would be wrapped in cloth, thick enough to prevent burns but thin enough to let the stored heat pass through, and tuck down into the bed near the feet, where cold tends to settle most stubbornly against a tired body. This simple, warmed stone, this humble ancestor of what we would eventually call a hot water bottle, could make a genuinely meaningful difference to how a night's sleep actually felt, taking the sharpest edge off the cold in that first hour of settling into bed before shared body heat beneath the wool had fully built up. There is something rather touching in recognizing how directly this small medieval comfort echoes forward into habits many of us still practice today. Anyone who has ever filled a hot water bottle before climbing into a cold bed is participating in a quiet and unbroken way in a tradition stretching back across hundreds of years to families gathered around a hearth, carefully choosing which stone to warm, tucking it down into straw and wool where tired feet would find it waiting. Clothing played its own quiet role in these final preparations for sleep. Wool again proved indispensable, not only in blankets, but in the simple shifts many people kept on through the night, rather than sleeping unclothed. A layer worn to bed added one more thin barrier of trapped air between skin and cold. Undressing fully in a room with no reliable warmth once the fire had been banked was, quite reasonably, not a risk most families were eager to take. For households with slightly greater means, a warm drink before bed offered one final small comfort, something sipped slowly by the last light of the fire before it was banked, warming the body gently from within before the household turned toward sleep. Herbal preparations, whatever dried plants a family had gathered through the warmer months, might be steeped for this purpose. A small, comforting ritual passed between family members in the low firelight. None of these small comforts, taken individually, amounted to very much against the true scale of a medieval winter's cold. But taken together, stacked atop everything else we have already explored, the banked fire, the shared warmth of livestock kept close, the straw mattress, the heavy wool, the shared body heat of a whole family gathered beneath it. These small comforts formed one more layer in an elaborate, largely unspoken system of survival, refined not through any single invention, but through generations of families quietly noticing what helped, and passing that knowledge forward until it became simply the unremarkable, everyday shape of how a household got through a long winter night. Warmth, as we have already seen, was never something that came only from fire and wool and shared breath in the dark. It came, in its own vital way, from what a family had managed to store away across the warmer months, and from how carefully that store was rationed out across the long, hungry stretch between the first hard frost and the first green shoots of spring. A body that is fed, even modestly, holds its own warmth, far better than a body running on empty, and every peasant family understood this instinctively, even without any formal knowledge of the biology behind it. The preparation for winter had begun long before the first snow touched the thatch. Through late summer and autumn, a household's entire rhythm bent toward preservation. Grain, once harvested and threshed, was stored carefully against damp and vermin, ground gradually across the winter months into the coarse flour that would become the bread forming the backbone of nearly every peasant meal. Vegetables that could be dried or kept in some cool, dark corner of the cottage, root vegetables especially, onions, turnips, whatever the household's small garden plot had produced, were laid in against the months when nothing at all would grow in frozen ground. Meat, Where a family was fortunate enough to have any beyond what their livestock provided in milk and labour was salted, smoked, or dried, stretching a single slaughtered animal across weeks of otherwise lean eating. A pig, if a family kept one, was very often slaughtered in late autumn, specifically because the arriving cold made it possible to preserve the meat without spoiling, one more way in which winter's rhythm shaped nearly every practical decision a household made. The meal most closely associated with peasant life through this period was a simple, thick stew or porridge, known broadly as pottage, a mixture of whatever grains, vegetables, and occasionally small scraps of meat or fat a household had on hand, simmered slowly over the same hearth that warmed the room, in a single pot that might, in the poorest households, be added to and drawn from continuously across days, never quite emptied, never quite the same mixture twice. This was not food designed for variety. It was food designed for warmth, for calories, for the simple, practical business of keeping a body fueled through short days and long, cold nights of hard physical labour, even in winter, when there was still wood to gather and animals to tend. There is a particular comfort in imagining that pot hanging low over the fire, filling the small room with steam and warmth long before anyone sat down to eat. In a home with no separate kitchen, the simple act of preparing a meal contributed its own small measure of heat to the household, the same fire doing double duty as both cook and comforter. A family gathering close to share a bowl of hot pottage on a bitter evening was engaging, whether they thought of it this way or not, in one more small ritual of shared warmth, hands wrapped around a warm bowl, the whole household drawn together in that same tight, deliberate closeness, governing nearly everything else about how they survived the season. Bread held a particular importance beyond its nutrition, connecting directly back to the fire. Baking required sustained heat, and households too poor to maintain their own oven might bake communally, in a shared village oven tended in turn, or bake batches large enough to last several days, since firing an oven from cold was itself a costly undertaking, not to be repeated more often than necessary. Fresh bread was something of an occasional pleasure, even in households that ate it daily, most of what was actually consumed being bread baked days earlier, softened by dunking directly into warm pottage rather than eaten alone. Drink, in the depths of winter, tended toward warmth wherever a household had the means to manage it. Water alone offered little comfort against the cold, and so households turned to weak ale, a staple across much of medieval Europe, regardless of season, or to warmed broths left over from the day's cooking, sipped slowly by the fire. Nothing about winter survival existed in isolation. It was, in every sense, a whole and interconnected system, each piece supporting the others. And within that system, particular care was always given to those members of the household least able to fend for themselves, because a medieval winter was never an equal burden borne identically by everyone beneath a single roof. Infants and very small children, unable to regulate their own body heat as effectively as an adult, were placed at the very centre of the family bed, surrounded on every side by parents and older siblings. Swaddling, the practice of wrapping an infant snugly in cloth, served a double purpose in this world, offering both the sense of security many cultures have associated with tight wrapping and, just as practically, an additional insulating layer. A mother nursing an infant through the deep hours of a winter night, perhaps during that same segmented waking hour, was engaged in one more small act within this larger system, warmth and nourishment offered together in the same quiet, dark hour. The elderly of the household faced their own version of this vulnerability, joints and bones aching more sharply in the deep cold, recovery from illness a longer and more uncertain proposition. Where a household had the means, a slightly larger share of warmed stones, a position closer to the fire, went most often to the oldest members of the family, not out of any formal system, but out of the same quiet, practical care, shaping every other decision about how limited warmth was distributed through a household that never had quite enough of it to go entirely unrationed. Warmth, as we have seen again and again, was never something a single person could simply possess on their own in this world. It had to be built, shared, and carefully tended, spread through a household in whatever measure each member most needed, meal after meal, all the way through to the far, still distant edge of spring. Clothing itself deserves a slower look tonight, because it was never merely something worn during the day and shed at night. It was, quietly, one of the most sophisticated pieces of the entire winter survival system, and it began not with any single garment, but with the humble sheep grazing somewhere on the frozen edge of the village, or, more often for the poorest families, borrowed or bartered wool acquired through neighbours who did keep flocks. Wool remained, across nearly every layer of medieval dress, the single most important material a peasant family owned, not because it was luxurious, but because it was extraordinarily practical. Wool traps air within the structure of its own fibres, and trapped air, still and undisturbed, is one of the most effective insulators available to any people, medieval or modern. It also, remarkably, retains a good portion of its warming ability even when damp, a genuinely valuable property in a world with no reliable way to dry sodden clothing quickly and no synthetic fabric waiting in the wings to do the job better. A peasant, caught in a sudden snowfall while tending animals or gathering firewood, soaked through by the time they reached home, was still in wool, better protected against the worst of the cold than they would have been in almost any other material available to them. Layering was the governing principle of medieval winter dress, in exactly the same way it governed nearly everything else we've already walked through tonight. A simple linen or woolen undergarment sat closest to the skin, worn both for warmth and for the practical reason that it could be washed more easily than heavier outer garments, protecting those outer layers from the sweat and dirt of daily labour. Over this came the primary garment, a wool tunic or dress depending on the wearer, often reaching to the knee or below for men, and to the ankle for women, providing the bulk of the day's insulation. In the coldest months this might be supplemented further still with an additional over-tunic or a heavy cloak fastened at the shoulder or throat, offering one more layer against wind that no single garment alone could fully block. Hoods and coverings for the head mattered a great deal more in this world than modern winter dress sometimes remembers, and for good practical reason. A significant portion of the body's heat is lost through an uncovered head, and medieval peasants, without any formal understanding of that particular physiological detail, nonetheless arrived at the same practical conclusion through simple lived experience. Hoods attached to cloaks, separate woolen caps, and simple cloth coverings wrapped and tied beneath the chin were common across nearly every level of medieval society, worn by men and women alike whenever outdoor labour demanded exposure to the winter air. Hands and feet, the extremities most vulnerable to the true bite of frost, received their own particular attention. Mittens, simpler and warmer than fingered gloves, since they kept the fingers together to share warmth rather than isolating each one separately in its own thin sleeve of fabric, were common wherever wool could be spared for the purpose. Footwear presented its own particular challenge, since leather, the primary material, available for shoes and boots, offered reasonable protection against wet ground, but comparatively little insulation against true cold on its own. This was solved, as so much else in this story has been solved, through layering. Woolen leggings or hose worn beneath outer leg coverings, and thick woolen socks or wrappings worn inside leather shoes added the insulating warmth that the leather itself could not provide, while the leather handled the separate job of keeping feet dry against snow and mud. There is something worth noticing in how thoroughly this whole system of dress mirrors the logic we have already seen at work in the cottage itself. Just as the wattle and daub walls trapped a layer of still air within their woven structure, and just as the thatched roof held warmth beneath its tightly bundled straw, wool clothing worked by trapping still air against the body, layer after layer, each one adding its own small measure of insulation to the whole. The peasant household, in this sense, was not really building one system for the house and a separate system for the body. It was applying the same fundamental principle, trapped air as insulation, at every scale available to them, from the walls of the cottage down to the weave of a woolen sock. Clothing was also, of course, expensive to produce relative to a peasant family's overall means, requiring the raising of sheep or the trading for wool, the labour of spinning that wool into thread, and the further labour of weaving that thread into cloth, all of it typically undertaken by the women of the household across the long evenings of the year in whatever hours remained after the day's other labour was done. A single woolen garment represented a genuine investment of time and resources, which meant that clothing, once made, was mended rather than replaced, patched and repaired across years of wear, passed down from an older child to a younger one as bodies grew and old garments were outgrown rather than worn out. Nothing in this careful economy of warmth went to waste if it could possibly be helped. Come nightfall, as we touched on earlier in this journey, many peasants did not fully undress before settling into bed, keeping simple shifts or underlayers on through the night, rather than risk the vulnerability of bare skin against a room that, however carefully the fire had been banked, would inevitably grow colder as the night wore on. This was not laziness or a lack of concern for comfort. It was, once again, the same careful, practiced logic running through every single decision this whole story has traced tonight. The constant, quiet calculation of how best to preserve warmth against a season that offered no margin for carelessness, stitched, quite literally, into the very clothes a family wore to sleep. No single household, however carefully built, however well stocked, however skillfully its fire was tended, could survive a truly hard winter entirely alone. And medieval peasants understood this with a clarity that our more isolated modern lives sometimes make difficult to fully appreciate. The village itself, The whole scattered cluster of cottages we glimpsed at the very start of tonight's journey functioned as its own larger system of shared warmth and shared survival, extending far beyond the walls of any single home. Firewood gathering, one of the most essential and most physically demanding tasks of the entire winter season, was very often undertaken communally, or at the very least governed by shared customs that ensured no single family could simply claim an entire woodland for themselves while a neighbour went cold. Many villages held rites to gather deadwood, fallen branches, and sometimes a limited allowance of standing timber from a shared area of forest or woodland attached to the manor or the village itself. Rites that had been established and understood across generations, and that were taken very seriously precisely because fuel, in a world without any alternative source of heat, was quite literally a matter of life and death. A family that fell short on their woodpile part-way through a hard winter faced a genuine crisis, and it was not uncommon in such circumstances for neighbours to share from their own stores, understanding that the favour might well need to be returned in some future winter when the misfortune fell the other way. This spirit of mutual obligation extended into nearly every corner of village winter life. A household whose fire had gone out entirely through some mishap or simple bad luck could and did turn to a neighbour for a borrowed ember, carried carefully between houses in some covered vessel to protect it from the wind during the short walk between one hearth and another. This was not viewed as an imposition to be embarrassed about. It was simply how a village functioned, an ordinary and expected part of communal life, the same unspoken understanding that governed the sharing of tools, the lending of a spare blanket to a family who had lost one to wear or damage, the offer of shelter to a traveller caught out in a sudden snowstorm rather than risk turning them away to face the cold alone. Livestock, too, benefited from this same communal spirit in villages fortunate enough to have any shared grazing land or shared storage for winter fodder. A family whose own hay stores ran short before spring finally arrived might find a neighbour willing to share from their own supply, understanding that a starving animal helped no one, and that the strength of the village as a whole depended, in some real sense, on the survival of every household's livestock, not merely their own. Animals were, after all, not simply a source of nighttime warmth as we explored earlier, but essential working partners for the labour of spring ploughing and planting still many months away, and a family that lost their livestock to a hard winter faced consequences stretching far beyond that single cold season. There is a particular warmth, if we can use that word here in more than its literal sense, in imagining how this communal spirit might have played out on the very coldest nights of deep winter, when even the most carefully built cottage, even the most carefully banked fire, might not be quite enough against an especially brutal stretch of weather. Some historical accounts and later folk memory suggest that on the harshest nights, neighbouring families might gather together beneath a single roof, pooling their numbers and their warmth in exactly the same way a single family pooled theirs beneath one set of blankets, the household with the sturdiest walls or the most reliable fire opening its door to those whose own shelter felt less secure against a particularly punishing cold snap. Whether this happened as a matter of frequent routine or as a genuine emergency measure reserved for only the very worst nights, likely varied considerably by region, by community, and by the particular severity of any given winter. But the underlying instinct that survival was better secured together than apart runs consistently through nearly every piece of evidence we have from this period at every scale, from the single shared bed of one family up to the whole cooperating structure of an entire village. This communal instinct was not born from any particular sentimentality, any more than the family sharing warmth beneath one blanket was purely an act of tenderness rather than practical necessity. It emerged, like so much else in this story, from simple, hard experience, repeated across countless winters, of exactly what happened to isolated households who tried to face the season entirely alone. A village that hoarded rather than shared, that turned away rather than took in, was a village more likely to lose members to the cold, and in a world where every pair of hands mattered enormously to the labour of the following spring and summer, that loss was felt by everyone, not merely by the family directly affected. Cooperation in this sense was not simply kindness for its own sake, though kindness surely played its part. It was, quite plainly, good sense, refined across generations into an entire unspoken social contract that helped an entire community, and not merely any single household within it, make it through to the other side of winter. Winter, for all the careful indoor warmth we have spent so much of tonight exploring, could not simply be waited out from beneath a pile of wool blankets. There was work, unglamorous and often genuinely dangerous, that had to be done outdoors regardless of how deep the snow lay or how sharply the wind cut across the open fields, and it is worth spending some time tonight with exactly what that work demanded of the people who carried it out, because it reveals, perhaps more clearly than anything else in this story, just how thin the margin for error truly was. Firewood, as we touched on a moment ago, did not gather itself, and the reserves a family had stored across autumn, however carefully rationed, inevitably needed supplementing as winter stretched on longer than any household could fully predict. This meant venturing out into snow-covered woodland, often in the bitter early morning or late afternoon hours when the day's meagre light was at its most usable, to gather fallen branches, to collect dead wood, and, where rights and season allowed, to fell what limited standing timber a family was permitted to take. This was cold, physically demanding labour, undertaken in clothing that, however carefully layered, could never fully compensate for hours spent exposed to open winter air, and it carried real risk. Frostbite, though rarely named or understood in the medical terms we would use today, was nonetheless a recognized danger, particularly to fingers, toes, and the exposed skin of the face, and a peasant caught too long in truly severe cold, especially if wind or wet snow compromised the insulating value of their wool clothing, faced genuine physical danger from the cold itself, separate entirely from any question of shelter back at the cottage. Livestock, too, demanded outdoor attention regardless of the weather, since animals housed partly or wholly within the family home, for warmth still needed feeding, watering, and basic care throughout the winter months. Water sources very often required breaking through a fresh layer of ice each morning before animals could drink, a task repeated daily across the entire cold season, requiring hands exposed to freezing water and freezing air in quick, repeated succession. Fodder, The hay and stored feed that had to sustain livestock across months when no fresh grazing existed anywhere in the frozen landscape needed hauling from storage to stall, checked regularly for spoilage or dampness that could ruin an entire winter's carefully gathered supply in a matter of days if left unaddressed. Beyond the immediate demands of fuel and livestock, winter brought its own particular seasonal tasks that varied by region and by the specific arrangement of a household's land and obligations. Thatching repairs, difficult and sometimes genuinely hazardous work atop a frozen and potentially slick roof, could not always wait for milder weather. If a section had been damaged by wind or the weight of accumulated snow, since a compromised roof threatened the very warmth the whole household depended upon for survival. Tool maintenance, the mending of the implements that would be needed the moment spring finally arrived and the frozen ground began to soften enough for ploughing, often filled whatever indoor hours the season allowed. A quiet, patient labour, undertaken by firelight in the same small room where the family slept, ate, and gathered each evening. There is a particular resilience worth pausing on here in recognising just how much genuinely difficult, genuinely risky labour continued straight through the very coldest months of the year, in a world with no possibility of simply staying indoors until conditions improved. A modern person faced with severe winter weather can very often choose to remain inside, protected, waiting for the storm to pass. A medieval peasant family rarely had that luxury. The animals still needed tending regardless of the temperature outside. The fuel supply still needed maintaining regardless of how deep the snow had drifted against the cottage door. And so, morning after morning throughout the hardest stretch of the year, someone in the household, very often more than one someone, pulled on every layer of wool they owned, wrapped themselves as best they could against a cold that showed no particular mercy, and stepped outside into it anyway, because the alternative, allowing the fire to run short of fuel or the animals to go unfed and unwatered, threatened the survival of the entire household far more directly than any single hour spent working in the cold ever could. This daily negotiation between necessary outdoor labour and the very real danger that same labour carried in severe winter conditions shaped the practical wisdom passed down through generations in ways both large and small. Families learned through hard and sometimes painful experience to recognize the particular quality of light and sky that warned of an approaching storm serious enough to delay outdoor work if it could possibly be delayed. They learned which tasks absolutely could not wait, the watering and feeding of animals chief among them, and which could be postponed by even a single day if conditions turned genuinely dangerous. They learned to work in pairs where possible, particularly for any task that ventured any real distance from the cottage itself, since a single person overcome by cold or injured, far from shelter, faced a danger that a companion, however limited their ability to help directly, could at least recognize and respond to, whether by offering immediate assistance or by hurrying back to raise the alarm. And when the outdoor labour of any given day was finally, mercifully complete, when the animals were fed and watered, the wood gathered and stacked, whatever repairs the day had demanded finally addressed, the return to the cottage itself, to the low fire and the close, shared warmth waiting inside, carried a particular weight of relief that is genuinely difficult for those of us who move seamlessly between heated buildings all winter long to fully appreciate. That threshold, stepping from the biting outdoor cold into even the modest warmth of a peasant cottage, represented, every single day throughout the winter season, a small and genuinely earned triumph, one repeated countless times across countless households in countless villages throughout every hard winter. This whole long, quiet story has been built around. Cold, in the medieval world, was never understood the way we understand it today, and this gap in understanding shaped how families thought about illness, about danger, and about their own bodies throughout the long winter season in ways worth sitting with gently tonight, because it reveals something important about just how much uncertainty accompanied even the most careful, most practiced approach to winter survival we have spent this whole evening exploring together. Medieval medicine across nearly all of Europe during this period operated on a framework quite different from our own, built around the idea of bodily humours, four fundamental substances believed to govern health and temperament, requiring careful balance to maintain well-being. Cold, within this framework, was generally associated with particular humoral qualities, and exposure to excessive cold was believed capable of disrupting the body's proper balance, leading to illness through mechanisms that had nothing to do with what we now understand about viruses, bacteria, or the simple physical stress that genuine cold exposure places on the human body. A peasant family watching a member fall ill after a particularly hard stretch of winter labour would very likely have understood that illness through this humoral lens, attributing it to an imbalance requiring correction through diet, through rest, through whatever herbal remedies the household's accumulated folk knowledge suggested, rather than through any concept resembling germ theory or modern medical understanding. This is not, it is worth saying clearly, a story about medieval people being foolish or unsophisticated in how they approached illness. They were working, as every generation does, with the best knowledge available to them at the time, and that knowledge, however different from our own, was neither careless nor unconsidered. Herbal remedies passed down through generations and refined through long, practical experience, even without any formal scientific framework behind them, sometimes genuinely helped, whether through actual medicinal properties present in certain plants or through the simple, real comfort of warmth and care offered alongside them. Rest, when illness struck, was recognized as valuable, even if the underlying explanation for why rest helped differed considerably from our modern understanding of the body's need to conserve energy while fighting infection. What medieval families lacked, though, was any real understanding of certain specific dangers that we now recognize clearly, and this gap mattered enormously in the context of a season spent largely indoors, in close quarters, around an open fire with no chimney to properly vent its smoke. We touched earlier, rather lightly, on the smoke that filled a peasant cottage each evening as the fire burned, curling beneath the thatched roof, before finding its way out through whatever gaps the roof provided. This was understood at the time simply as an unavoidable and largely harmless, if mildly unpleasant feature of indoor life in winter, the price paid for keeping precious warmth inside a little longer rather than losing. It immediately up a chimney flew. What was not understood, because the underlying science would not exist for many centuries yet, was the genuine respiratory harm that prolonged exposure to wood smoke could cause over the course of a lifetime spent in homes built and heated this way. Chronic exposure to smoke of this kind is now recognized as a genuine contributor to respiratory illness, a slow, cumulative harm that would have been entirely invisible to a medieval family who had no framework for connecting a persistent cough or difficulty breathing in later life back to decades of winter evenings spent gathered close around a smoky hearth. Similarly, the very closeness that provided so much of the warmth this whole story has celebrated tonight, families sleeping pressed together, villages gathering under one roof on the harshest nights, also carried a genuine cost that medieval understanding could not fully account for. Illness that spread from one person to another through close, sustained contact. What we would now recognize as communicable disease transmitted through proximity moved efficiently through households and villages organized this way, particularly across the winter months when people spent so much more time gathered indoors in close quarters than they did during the warmer seasons when outdoor work drew everyone apart across open fields for much of the day. A medieval family had no concept of this transmission mechanism, and so illness that swept through a household or a village during the winter months was understood, again, through the available frameworks of the time: humoral imbalance, divine will, bad air believed to carry corrupting influences, rather than through any recognition that the very closeness keeping everyone warm was also simultaneously providing an efficient pathway for illness to travel from one person to the next. There is something worth holding gently here, in acknowledging this genuine tension at the very heart of medieval winter survival, without letting it curdle into any sense of judgment toward the people who lived through it. The closeness that kept a family from freezing was the same closeness that could, on occasion, spread illness through an entire household in the space of a single week. The smoky fire that kept a room warm through the darkest hours was the same fire whose smoke, breathed in night after night across a lifetime, carried a genuine long-term cost that no one at the time had any way of recognizing or preventing. This was not a failure of intelligence or care on the part of the families living through it. It was simply the honest, complicated reality of surviving a genuinely dangerous season with the knowledge available at the time. A reality where every solution carried its own quiet cost, and where the people making these choices night after night, winter after winter, were doing so with real wisdom, real care, and the very best understanding their world could offer them, even when that understanding fell short of the full picture. We can now see so much more clearly from centuries of hindsight and accumulated scientific knowledge they could never have possessed. It would be a mistake, and a fairly significant one, to imagine that every peasant family across medieval Europe experienced winter in quite the same way, and it is worth pausing here gently to acknowledge just how much variation actually existed beneath the broad picture we have been painting together throughout this whole story. The word peasant itself covers an enormous range of actual circumstances, and the particular shape a family's winter took depended heavily on where exactly that family sat within a social and legal structure considerably more complicated than the simple image of uniform medieval poverty sometimes suggests. At one end of this spectrum sat the serf, bound to a particular manor and a particular lord through obligations that shaped nearly every aspect of daily and seasonal life, including, quite directly, how winter itself was experienced. A serf typically owed labour to their lord across the working year, and while the depths of winter brought some natural reduction in the heaviest agricultural demands, simply because frozen ground could not be ploughed and no crops could be tended in the fields, serfs very often owed other forms of labour and obligation that continued regardless of season, along with various dues and payments that had to be met from whatever resources the household could gather. A serf family's access to woodland for fuel gathering, to common grazing land for whatever livestock they kept, and to the grain their own small plots produced, was frequently governed by customs and restrictions set by the manor itself, meaning the margin for error in a hard winter could be considerably thinner than for households with greater independence. Free peasants, by contrast, held their land and their labour with considerably more independence, owing rent, very often in the form of produce or occasionally coin, rather than the more extensive labour obligations that bound a serf to their lord's own fields and demands. This greater independence did not necessarily mean a free peasant family enjoyed a dramatically more comfortable winter than a serf family living nearby, since actual wealth, actual land quality, and actual luck across any given year mattered enormously regardless of legal status, but it did mean somewhat greater flexibility in how a household managed its own resources, its own fuel gathering, and its own preparation for the winter months ahead, without quite the same web of obligations dictating exactly how that preparation had to unfold. Above both of these categories, though still considerably below the nobility we might more readily associate with grand stone halls and roaring fires, sat households sometimes described as villeins, or in various regions and various centuries, by other similar terms describing peasants who held somewhat more land, somewhat more livestock, and somewhat more general prosperity than the poorest cottagers scraping by on the smallest plots available. A wealthier villein family might own several head of cattle rather than one, might maintain a somewhat sturdier and better maintained cottage with a more reliably thatched roof and better sealed walls, and might enter winter with genuinely more substantial stores of grain, salted meat, and firewood than a poorer neighbour facing the same season with considerably less to draw upon. This mattered enormously in practice, since the margin between a comfortable winter and a genuinely dangerous one very often came down to exactly these kinds of differences: the depth of the woodpile, the number of animals available to share their warmth and their labour, the thickness of the walls standing between a family and the wind. Regional variation added its own layer of difference on top of these questions of social and economic standing. A peasant family in the milder, more temperate regions of Western Europe faced a genuinely different winter than a family living further north or at higher altitude, where the cold arrived earlier, lingered longer, and cut considerably deeper across the darkest months of the year. Building materials, too, varied by region according to whatever the local landscape provided most readily. Stone construction appearing more commonly in areas where suitable stone was locally available and where the tradition and skill for working it had developed over generations, while timber and wattle and daub construction, the style we have spent so much of tonight exploring, remained more common in regions where timber was the more readily available and more traditionally worked material. None of this variation changes the fundamental picture. This whole story has been built around tonight, the shared fire, the shared warmth of livestock and family alike, the careful layering of wool and straw, the whole quiet, communal system of survival refined across countless generations. But it is worth honouring the fact that this system played out differently, sometimes quite significantly differently, depending on exactly which family, in exactly which village, in exactly which region of a genuinely vast and varied medieval Europe we happen to be imagining as we drift through this story together tonight. The poorest cottager, facing winter with a single thin blanket and barely enough fuel to see the season through, experienced a considerably more precarious version of everything we have explored than the more prosperous villain family down the same lane, with their sturdier walls and their fuller woodpile and their extra head of cattle contributing that much more warmth to the shared winter night. Both families were, in the truest sense, medieval peasants surviving a medieval winter, but the texture of that survival, the margin for error, the depth of the worry accompanying each hard frost, varied, considerably depending on exactly where within this broad and complicated social world a given family happened to sit. And then, slowly, after each long night this whole story has walked through together, the darkness finally began to loosen its grip. There was no single dramatic moment when winter darkness gave way to morning in a medieval cottage, no sudden flood of light, the way a modern room might brighten under an electric lamp at the flick of a switch. Dawn arrived, the way it always has in this part of the world during the depths of winter, reluctantly, gradually, announcing itself first not through sight, but through the faintest shift in the quality of the darkness pressing against the shuttered windows. The fire was almost always the first thing tended once someone in the household stirred, and there was a particular skill involved in this morning ritual, practiced countless times across a lifetime until it became as automatic as breathing. The layer of ash that had insulated the embers through the long night was carefully brushed aside, revealing, if the banking had been done well the evening before, a small glowing core of heat still very much alive beneath its grey blanket. Fresh kindling would be laid gently against those surviving embers, and then came the careful, practised work of breathing new life into the fire. A slow, steady stream of breath directed at the glowing coals, coaxing them from a dull orange smoulder back toward genuine flame. When the banking had gone well, small flames would begin to lick upward within minutes, until the fire that had spent the whole night as nothing more than a whisper of heat beneath ash was once again a proper, living flame. There is something worth noticing in how central this single moment was to the entire rhythm of medieval domestic life. On the coldest mornings of deep winter, that first small crackle of returning flame carried a weight of relief difficult for those of us with instant, effortless heat to fully appreciate. It meant the household had survived another night. Beyond the shutters the animals stirred as well, sensing the same faint shift in light and air, and in the coldest mornings there would very often have been frost, delicate and pale, clinging to the inside edges of the wooden shutters where warm breath and cold air had met and left their mark overnight, a small, quiet reminder of exactly how much work had gone into keeping that cold from winning. If you step back now from every individual piece we have walked through together across this whole long journey, the mud and timber walls, the smoke curling patiently toward its exit beneath the thatch, the careful banking of the fire each evening, the animals brought in close, the straw mattress and the layered wool, the segmented waking somewhere in the deep middle of the night, the warmed stones, the shared pot of pottage, the borrowed ember carried between neighbouring hearths. What you are really looking at is not a collection of clever medieval technologies at all. There was no single brilliant invention that solved the problem of winter cold for these families. What there was, instead, was something quieter and in many ways more remarkable. A whole integrated way of living that treated warmth not as something you simply possessed or lacked, but as something you actively built, night after night, season after season, out of whatever materials, whatever animals, and most of all, whatever people you had close around you. This is, in the end, perhaps the truest and gentlest lesson tucked inside tonight's whole quiet journey. Survival in this world was never really an individual accomplishment. It was a collective effort, sustained through countless small acts of shared warmth, repeated every single night by every single household across every single village, all of them quietly, unglamorously, and successfully getting each other through to spring. Grandmothers passing down exactly how tightly to pack the ash over the embers so they would still be glowing at dawn. Fathers teaching sons which stones held heat longest. Whole communities refining and passing forward generation after generation, an entire quiet science of staying warm together, built not in any laboratory, but in the daily, ordinary practice of family and village life repeated across hundreds of winters. There is a particular kind of resilience in that, worth sitting with gently as you drift toward your own rest tonight, warm and safe in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginably luxurious to the families we have spent this evening visiting. No aching cold pressing against thin walls tonight, no banked embers to worry over through the dark hours, and yet, underneath all of that comfort, the same basic human instinct persists, the same quiet pull toward warmth, toward closeness, toward the simple, ancient comfort of not facing the dark alone. Somewhere, long ago, in a small mud and timber cottage buried in snow, a family finished banking their fire, gathered close beneath their layered wool, listened to the low, steady breathing of livestock somewhere nearby, and let the ordinary, hard-won magic of shared warmth carry them gently toward sleep. And now, so very many winters later, safe and warm in whatever quiet corner of the modern world you are listening from, you can let that same gentle pull carry you toward sleep as well. If tonight's slow walk through a frozen medieval world helped ease you toward rest, consider leaving this video a like and subscribing here at Bedtime Survivalist, so more sleepy travellers can find their way to these journeys through the coldest, hardest, and strangely most human corners of the past. Wherever you are tonight, however cold or warm the world outside your own window happens to be, I hope you rest easy. The fire is banked, the animals are settled, the family at last is asleep, and so, dear listener, can you be?